Let's talk about today. A very resourceful person who came in with all of our audio-visual equipment on the floor and has gotten us all set up. Let me tell you a little bit about Drew Smith and what we're going to talk about today. Drew is the Associate Librarian with the USF Tampa Library. 2016 was the winner of the Philby Award for Genealogical Librarianship presented by the National Genealogical Society. He's past president of the Florida Genealogical Society of Tampa. He served on the boards of the Federation of Genealogical Societies, the Association of Professional Genealogists, and the Florida State Genealogical Society. He's a host of the Genealogy Connection podcast and the co-host of the Genealogy Guys podcast. He's the author of the book Social Networking for Genealogists, co-author of the book Advanced Genealogy Research Techniques, and has written extensively for a number of genealogical print and online magazines. His latest book, Organize Your Genealogy, Strategies and Solutions for Everyday Research, was published in 2016 by Family Tree Books. So join me today in welcoming Drew Smith, who's going to present to us on Before You Test DNA Basics You Need to Know. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. It is great to see a great big turnout, considering what we've had to deal with in the last week or so. And when I was asked to speak here, I looked at previous Lunch and Learns and thinking, okay, well, most of them are about history, but then I realized, well, so is this presentation. It's just a different kind of history, and I'm going to make a case for exactly why it's history, but also show you what you need to know. And the handout should help you as well, I think, pretty well. So you've already seen all that. We can skip right over the bio. I'm going to talk about DNA as a genealogical record format. In other words, the idea that it is a record for genealogy just like any other. I'm going to talk about the fact that there are different types of human DNA that we need to be aware of, not just one type, but many. That each one has its own inheritance pattern, and you have to understand how each type is inherited. I'm going to talk about how you will then use the research problem or question you might have about your own family to figure out what test to take or who should take the test. And finally, I'll talk about the 5. It used to be 3, now it's 5 major DNA testing companies. I will mention those very briefly. And of course, there'll be time afterwards for those who can stay with us for questions. So let's talk about what's a genealogical record. When we're doing research on our families, genealogy is a type of history, but normally about our own families. What is a record for genealogy? What does that mean? Well, I would say it's a source of information, something that we can get information from that tells us something about a person. Usually it's one of our own ancestors. It could be some other relative that we're interested in, or maybe we're doing it for a friend. Such as the details about their lives. What did they do during their lives? Or maybe how is one person related to another? We may have curiosity about that. Maybe related to us or related to someone else. And these records come in a lot of different formats. Let's talk about the ones you're probably already familiar with if you've done any research on your family, and even if you haven't. So the first thing is, when you first get into genealogy, you may realize that you're probably going to be dealing with a lot of print materials such as books, magazines, journals, newsletters. You will find these in all kinds of libraries, particularly libraries dedicated to genealogical research. Many people over the years have written family history books. And when you get started in this kind of thing, you don't get too intimidated by that. We've all dealt with books and magazines, so we're used to using them. We understand how to use a table of contents. We understand how to use an index. And so that's what we do when we get started with genealogy, is we seek out books that may help us. Maybe they've already been written about some branch of our family. I know I did that when I got started and found that while there was no book that covered all my family, there were a few books that covered certain branches going far enough back. Then you get into this thing called microfilm and microfiche. And you might say, well, that's a little intimidating. I still, because I don't use microfilm and microfiche every day, I still have to sit down at a microfiche reader, study it for a few minutes, and try to figure out how am I going to load this piece of film. So it's always a bit of a challenge. People that do it every day don't even think twice about it. And there's still a lot of this being used. The Family Search, which is the genealogical branch of the LDS out in Salt Lake City, has 2 million rolls of microfilm. They have been scanning it, putting it up online as fast as they can. They still need a couple more years to finish their process. But most of us have worked with microfilm, and I'm blessed by being near the John F. Germany Public Library over in Tampa, which has an amazing collection, has lots of microfilm. So as a genealogist, I can get to a lot of what I need. Cemeteries. So most of us, again, even before you did genealogy, if you ever done genealogy, you probably visited a lot of cemeteries because of deaths in your own family. And so you would go there, you would be interested in maybe where the stones were, what the iconography was, what are the various symbols used on stones, particularly the older stones had a lot of interesting symbols. And what you might have learned as you became a genealogist is you might learn that, well, you also have to pay attention to how stones are positioned around each other, because the people that are buried next on the left or on the right might be cousins, and you want to actually pay attention to that. But again, most of us are not terribly intimidated by cemeteries. We've been visiting them all our lives. Photograph. So again, we all have had family photos. Once you get into genealogy, you learn how important they are, particularly if they're very hopefully written on the back so you can tell who the people are. I don't know about you, but I have lots of boxes of photos that my brother gave me after my mom passed that I have no idea who some of these people are. And I may never know until the technology is good enough to do facial recognition and figure out who these people are. I'm hoping for that someday. I do like to do this as sort of interactive because this is a photo of one of my sets of grandparents, the last photo in which all these people were still alive that I know of. One of my sets of grandparents and their 7 children, including one of my parents. Can you figure out which person there is my parent?
The guy right in the middle.
The guy in the middle, right there in the middle. That's Uncle Ernest. He taught me how to play cards. He was one of my favorite uncles on that side of the family. Any other guesses? The man over here, near this one? That's Uncle Ansel. No, the man on the left is Uncle Walter. He was the oldest of the children. So somebody had a hand back there.
The lady to the bottom left?
Down here, over here? Yeah. Aunt Cleo. She lived out in California, San Diego. We got to see her a couple times. So she was born 1912, same year as the Titanic. Yes. You're running out of folks here. Anybody else want to guess? Number 3? Which one? Oh, on the bottom. Well, that's grandmother and grandfather. They're in the middle, you know. That's the grandparents there. So remember them quite fondly. Anybody else want to get? Yes. The lady in the black dress. That was my favorite aunt, Aunt Jenny. And in fact, my favorite story about Aunt Jenny is that when she showed up at this little get-together, she was not dressed appropriately for the photo because my Aunt Jenny liked to go fishing. So she might have had a blouse and shorts. So she went into a back room with my cousin Billie Jean and swapped dresses. So that's actually Billie Jean's dress with the big white plastic belt. And it was actually after Aunt Jenny passed in about 1992 that I got serious about genealogy. She was my favorite aunt, and I got to see everybody at the reunion. We're running out of people here, you know. I'll go ahead and say the lady down here is my mother near the TV, and that's Mom. But again, the fun of looking at family photos, figuring out who people are, looking at other photos to compare, that's something we have done all our lives, even if you didn't get into genealogy. All of these things are genealogical record formats. So is this. And you shouldn't be intimidated. Okay, there's some science involved. We'll cover that. That's okay. But just as genealogists had to learn how to use microfilm, how to use cemeteries to look for the right things, how to look for the right things in photos, as a genealogist or someone doing research on your family history, you just need to learn some things about DNA to make use of it. So that's what we're going to be doing for the rest of this period. It is a source of information. We can get information from DNA. It can tell us about someone's distant ancestors, and actually recent ones too, but certainly distant ancestors. The nice thing about DNA is you can compare one person's DNA with another person's, so you can figure out how those two people are related. People do this all the time. And I would say, therefore, it's a genealogical record format. So you need to learn how to use it. So how does it work? All right, it's a molecule. Now, I was given some water here, and water is a molecule. But of course, it's a very simple molecule. It's H2O. There's not a lot to it. DNA is a very complex molecule. It has lots of parts to it. And what happens is, during the reproductive process, the parents take part of their DNA, a copy of some of their DNA, to pass to the next generation, to each of their children. Every generation this occurs, generation after generation. Each mother and each father is passing a copy of part of their DNA to the next generation. And in fact, they're not even giving each of their children exactly the same DNA. Unless they've got identical twin children, every of those children has different combination of their DNA. And this is why you know that sometimes one sibling looks more like dad and one looks more like mom, or has this trait or whatever. That's because of the way that the DNA is being passed. But not all DNA is the same. We talk about DNA as if it's just one thing, but there's actually lots of pieces to DNA. So there's actually different types. They are inherited differently because of the process of reproduction. And we have to understand this because if you're going to use DNA testing for genealogical purposes, you need to understand what types of DNA and how they're inherited. How does all that work? All right, so I'm going to get a little biology. If this gives you bad flashbacks to your high school biology class, I'm sorry. But this is a picture of a human cell. We have like 1 trillion cells in our body. And so this is a typical one. And so the big purple thing or whatever that is right there is the nucleus, where sort of the main part of what goes on and derives what the cell does. But there's lots of stuff floating out outside the nucleus, including over there, number 9, the mitochondrion. And actually every single cell has hundreds of those, or maybe even thousands of those mitochondria in there. So we're going to talk about mitochondrial DNA. We're going to talk about nuclear DNA. These are the two major types. So the mitochondrial DNA is found in the mitochondria, and again, that could be several thousand of those in each of those cells. That's why often when they are doing DNA testing of remains, particularly very old remains, they may only be able to get mitochondrial DNA because frankly there's so much of it, there's a better chance that some of it was preserved. It's not as likely that the nuclear DNA was preserved. It depends on the circumstances. Nuclear DNA is found in the nucleus of every one of our cells. The only cell that really does not have a nucleus are mature red blood cells. Those do not. They would maybe have mitochondria. They do not have a nucleus. All right, one more term I want to throw at you. Some of these are in your handout. The term genome, the idea that when we talk about all the DNA in our bodies, everything, the human genome, so when we say the sum total of all of our DNA, that's the human genome. But we can also talk about the nuclear genome or the mitochondrial genome, meaning all the DNA in the mitochondria or all the DNA in the nucleus. So we might use those terms too. So that's the big picture term. Now let's go the opposite. What's the smallest bit of DNA that we can talk about? Well, it turns out that all human DNA, and this is true of most living things, consists of chains of molecules. And these molecules really come in 4 types. So there's cytosine, guanine, adenine, and thymine, and they are abbreviated C, G, A, and T. You don't have to worry about what the letters stand for, but that's really the 4 types of molecules that get chained together to make our DNA. And this is true whether we're talking mitochondrial DNA or nuclear DNA. They are called nucleobases or bases. So that's the smallest bit of DNA that we ever think about or look at are those bases. So what happens is the bases actually become sort of a double chain. So one base actually links to a different base across, and it just works out so that the A, if there's an A, it always pairs up with a T, and the C always pairs up with a G. They're just kind of designed to lock together that way, so you're going to see that. So I'm going to start with the mitochondrial. In some ways, this is the easiest kind of DNA to understand, although you're going to find out it's probably the least useful for genealogical purposes. So mitochondrial DNA is actually only 16,500 base pairs. So we talked about that littlest, smallest bit of DNA being a base pair, and so the mitochondrial DNA, there's 16,500 of them, and they're in a ring, in a circle. So you may have seen chromosomes, other kinds, those are probably the nuclear ones. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. But the chain of mitochondrial DNA is in each one of those mitochondria. And as you can see from the diagram, we get ours from our mothers. How does that happen? Well, it turns out that the egg cell and the sperm cell both do have some mitochondrial DNA in them, but during conception, the part for the mitochondria that's in the sperm cell is actually discarded. So the mitochondria that you have, every one of you in this room, is a copy of your mother's mitochondrial DNA, which is a copy of her mother's mitochondrial DNA. We all have it, since we all have mitochondria. So it's going to look like this. We're down here on the bottom. We got our mitochondrial DNA inherited from our mother, who got it from her mother, who got it from her mother, all the way back in time. Okay. Which means, of course, that if you're doing a DNA test, mitochondrial DNA testing wouldn't help you much unless you were interested in that particular line of your ancestry. And so if you're interested in any other line of your ancestry, mitochondrial DNA really won't help you very much. Now, another term that you need to know is mutation. All right, so what is a mutation? Really, it's just a change. So what happens is when that copying is done from one generation to another, there can be a change. Sometimes that base, each of those little bits of DNA is not copied perfectly. Something changes, and it may be changed to a different base. How many of you have ever played the childhood game of telephone? Remember that? Someone's called some other names as well, gossip, I think, maybe Chinese whispers, but you know the game. String of people, somebody whispers something at one end, they each whisper it down the line to the other end. What happens to it? Changes a lot, actually, usually, because people hear what they think they hear. All right, so that's what's happening in this DNA process. There is always copying going on, but it's not perfect. And in fact, each of us probably has 100 mutations that are different from our parents. We're all mutants, all of us here. That's all right. So there's two ways you might have a difference. Again, the copying might result that you get a different base than was in the original. So an A might get changed to a C, or a T might get changed to a G, or whatever. You also might get some new bases. So you might get a base that gets inserted. Remember, we're talking here particularly about a chain. There could be an extra base that gets inserted that wasn't in the original, or the opposite. You might have a base that gets removed during the copying. This doesn't normally affect us. Most mutations are harmless. They don't cause any harm to us. Now, let's focus. We've talked about mitochondria. Let's focus on the nucleus, the nuclear DNA. There's really two types of nuclear DNA. There's autosomal and allosomal. Autosomal, and we all have 23 pairs of chromosomes in our nuclear DNA. That's the standard, that's the common. There are, of course, genetic deficiencies or problems when people might have a missing chromosome or an extra one, but for the vast majority of us, we always have 23 pairs. 22 pairs of those are the autosomal, and they've been assigned numbers by the biologists so that the largest pair is pair 1, and the next largest pair is pair 2, on down to the smallest pair, which is pair 22. So those are the numbers that are assigned to identify them as they talk about them. And then the remaining one is allosomal. You may never hear the word allosomal, but you might hear the term sex chromosome or sex-linked chromosome. Those are the X and the Y. And so what happens is every woman in this room has a pair of X's, and every man in this room has one X and one Y. So it is the Y chromosome that actually turns the fetus into a male, and when it doesn't, when there's just two X's, it comes out as female. All right. So that's important to know. So here's that picture of 22. Obviously, they don't line up this neatly in the actual cell, but that's how they're listed here. So you can see that pair 1 are fairly long, and pair 2 a little bit less long on the way down to some tiny ones down here to 22, and then the X and the Y. And that doesn't mean they're X and Y shaped. They're just called X and Y as letters to identify them. It doesn't refer to their shape in any way. So let's talk about Y. Again, we're going to kind of stay with the simpler ones now. Things will get a little more complicated as we go here, so stay with me. So the Y DNA, only males have it. As I said, women have two X's, a man has an X and a Y. Where did he get his from? Had to be from the father because your mother didn't have one. She has no Y DNA to give you. So me, I got my Y DNA from my father, he got it from his father, and so on. Now, one of the things that makes Y DNA testing interesting is it's frequently used in conjunction with a surname line, because in Western European culture and other cultures, usually children are given the surnames of their fathers. That's very common. So that means that as boys inherit Y DNA from their fathers, they're also inheriting their father's surname typically, and that means that Y DNA seems to travel along with the surname. So the chromosome, my Y DNA, I could call it the Smith chromosome, the Smith Y DNA, because all the Smiths that I'm related to, all the male Smiths, will have the same one. They all have copies from our distant common ancestor. All right? So again, what's the inheritance pattern? Interestingly enough, it's kind of the opposite of the mitochondrial pattern. In other words, although women will not have Y DNA, they can't take a Y DNA test. They would have to get, say, a father or a brother or maybe a male first cousin with a surname they're interested in to do the test. But that DNA is coming down strictly from what we would call the patrilineal line. So it's coming all the way down the surname line. Okay? Now we're going to get into the complications. Autosomal, those 22 pairs. All right. So you and I got our autosomal DNA from our parents. Remember that our parents had 22 pairs of autosomal DNA. We have 22 pairs of autosomal DNA. Ours pairs, we got one from mom, one from dad for each of those pairs. All right. So when our parents gave us their DNA, they're giving us 50% of what they've got. So dad has 100% autosomal DNA. He gives me half of it. He gives my brother half of it. He doesn't give my brother and me the same half. If he did, and mom did the same thing, we'd be identical twins. We're not. So we have a lot. Actually, siblings tend to have about 25% the same, full siblings. So I have a lot in common with my brother, but not everything. Obviously, you know your own siblings are different in some ways from you and alike in some ways. That's because of the 25% the same and the 25% difference. And as I said, unless we're talking identical twins, every sibling is getting some different mixture of DNA from their parents, which again makes every sibling different. So let's get this a little more complicated. We've got the kids down here. They got 50% of their father's DNA, 50% of their mother's. Their father has 50% of his father's DNA, 50% of his mother's. The mother's got 50% of her father's DNA, 50% of her mother's. Does that mean that the children have exactly 25% from their 4 grandparents? No. Because when dad gave me 50% of his, he didn't have to give me an exact share, equal share of what he got from his parents. He could have given me a little more from his father and a little less from his mother, or vice versa. My mother may have given me, you saw the picture of Granddaddy Martin and Grandmother Martin. My mother could have given me a little bit more of Granddaddy Martin and a little bit less of Grandmother Martin, or vice versa. So you will have close to 25% of your grandparents' DNA, each of your 4, but it won't necessarily be exactly 25%. It could be 22 or 21, where you got more from one grandparent than the other. It's going to vary a little bit. And this is going to keep going on generation after generation. Now that's going to cause some interesting problems. Here's the deal. So if I get 25% on average from each of my grandparents, that means I get about 12.5% on average from each of my great-grandparents, and about 6% from my great-great-grandparents, and so on. But those are averages. I could get less or more from each of those more distant ancestors. Sooner or later, there's going to be some ancestor that I don't get any DNA from, because the odds were just against it. The numbers start getting so low that it's not going to persist all the way down to me. It might go to my brother, it might go to my first cousin, but maybe there's some great-great-great-grandparent that I don't have any DNA from. And in fact, these numbers kind of share that with you. Your great-great-grandparents, those 16 people that are your great-great-grandparents, there's about almost 100% chance you've got some DNA from all of them. Might be a small amount, but you've got some from all of your 16 great-great-grandparents. But what about your 32 3x great-grandparents? There's only a 54% chance that you have some DNA from all 32 of them. And when you get to your 64 fourth great-grandparents, there's almost no chance that you have DNA from all of them. There's at least one of those people that probably, could be more than one, that has sort of dropped out, and you share no DNA with that ancestor of yours. You just did not inherit that little bit of DNA from them. It did not persist down to you. All right. One reason I want to bring this up is because sometimes people go, well, one of my fourth great grandparents or fifth great grandparents was Native American. But when I do the test, it doesn't show any. Well, okay. Is it still possible you had a Native American ancestor? Yes, it's possible. It's also possible that you didn't inherit enough of that DNA to be showing up in a test. It could happen. So as you get more and more distant, those things will drop out. You won't get DNA from all of them. So what's the chance now of your cousins? Because now we're interested in finding out maybe who our cousins are. How do we match our cousins? The odds of you matching a second cousin, and certainly anyone closer than a second cousin, is greater than 99%. We actually don't know of any documented cases where second cousins that were definitely second cousins because, maybe their parents tested and their grandparents tested, and we know they're second cousins, didn't share some DNA. Second cousins will almost certainly share DNA. So when you take a DNA test and your second cousin takes one and you don't match, there's a problem somewhere with somebody. You might have to do some more testing to figure out where the problem is, but there's a problem. There's a problem. But what about third cousins? Well, now things get a little different because there's actually only about a 90% chance you'll match a third cousin. There's a 10% chance that one of your verified documented third cousins won't share DNA with you. About a 10% chance. You just didn't inherit the same DNA from that ancestor that you and your third cousin share in common. And once you get to fourth cousins, it's about only a 45% chance that you'll share. When you get down to fifth cousins, only about a 15%. And when you get down to sixth cousins, it's less than 5%. Meaning, these DNA tests, these autosomal DNA tests that are the most popular, most common used in genealogy, when they're used to find cousins, they will certainly find everybody up to your second cousins who also test. They will find most of your third cousins and so forth. But once you get down to fifth and sixth, you may or may not match fifth and sixth cousins. I've matched a few fifth cousins. That's worked. But I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who are my fifth cousin that I'm not matching DNA with. The odds just don't favor it. All right. Now the last one, which is sort of complicated, X DNA. As I said, we all have some. All the women in here have 2 X chromosomes. All the men have 1. So what's the idea where this comes from? Well, again, I'm a guy. My 1 X chromosome has to come from my mother because my father gave me a Y. So Dad gave me a Y DNA. My mother gave me an X DNA. So I have one of those. If you're a woman in this room, you have 2 X's. You got one from Dad, one from his mother. Actually, though, think about it. If you're a woman and you have one from your mother, where did the other one come from? Her father, but where did he get it? His mother. In other words, the 2 X chromosomes that all the women in here have, one's from your mother, one's from your paternal grandmother. Right? Think about that for a minute. The one that your father gave you, he just passed on from the one he got from his mother, because that's the only X chromosome he had to give you. And so you didn't get an X chromosome from your paternal grandfather, whatever. So just kind of another way to look at it is, women, you have 1 X from mom, 1 X from paternal grandmother. Those are your 2 X chromosomes. Another way to look at it. So we've got this sort of interesting inheritance pattern. If you're a guy, the sort of bluish spot in the middle there, and each row back, each circle is another generation, that means if I have X DNA, it could not have come from my paternal side. My father gave me Y DNA. So it came from mom's side. She got it from her mother and her father, but her father only got it from his mother. So you see all these white sections, they represent individuals in my ancestry that I could not have inherited any X DNA from those people. Now, it doesn't mean that if the people that are in blue or pink or whatever, they could have given me X DNA. It doesn't mean they did. I might not have inherited any X DNA from them. But the people in white, representing those positions on this grid that are in white, none of those people could have given me X DNA. because it would involve going through not only a man, but actually 2 generations of males. And one rule that I just kind of keep in my head is X-DNA cannot be transmitted through 2 generations of males, because one male to another is only sending Y-DNA, not sending X-DNA. Women, the same thing, except again, the way the chart's looking is you've got the male side, you've got X-DNA from your father, but he got it from his mother, so again, no X-DNA from your paternal grandfather's side. All those people did not give you any X-DNA. No data there. So as I said, it's the most complicated one. This one takes a bit of studying to figure it out. So going on to what the research problem is that if you have a genealogical question or problem and you say to yourself, okay, could DNA help me with it? You have to first think about the inheritance patterns to say which DNA test should be taken. As I said, if I'm working on my father's family, the Smiths, will mitochondrial DNA help me? No, because that came from my mother. So mitochondrial DNA doesn't really help me with dad's side. All right? Now, on the other hand, if I'm interested in the Smiths, if I'm working on the Smiths, will Y-DNA help me? Yes, it could, because that's inherited through the Smith line. So I might take a Y-DNA test to see if I match any other Smiths. And if so, those are probably cousins that I have a common ancestor with. In fact, I did that because I had Smiths. I knew they were from Ireland, and at the time I didn't know where in Ireland they were from. So I hoped that by taking a Y-DNA test, I would match another Smith male who might know where in Ireland his family was from, and maybe that would be where mine's from. Well, as it turned out, I only had one match. He was a Smith, but his Smiths were actually from a different county from where mine eventually turned out to be. I don't know. So that didn't help me, but other people it has helped them very much. So you have to know about the inheritance patterns, and so again, knowing that mitochondrial is coming strictly from the matrilineal line, and that one is usually the most useless for a couple reasons. One is, even if you match somebody perfectly with mitochondrial DNA, because it doesn't mutate very quickly, that common ancestor could be many hundreds of years in the past. Now, I don't know about you, but how far back can you go on your matrilineal line? Your mother's 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 line. Those are really tough lines to do because the surname is changing every generation, and many times you come to a point and you go, I don't even know her maiden name. So the problem is, not only does that make it difficult, but the mitochondrial doesn't generally help you. What it does help you sometimes is help you rule out people, because if you do trace back to some woman and you think this other person also traces back to the same woman through another matrilineal line, you better share the same mitochondria, because if you don't, one of you's wrong or something's not quite right there. So what you want to do is figure out what type of test to be taken and who should take it. As I said, you're a woman. Let's say you're interested in the surname that you have. You can't take a Y-DNA test. You have to get a male that's related to you that has that surname, a brother, a male first cousin, uncle, whatever, that can be tested if that's what you're interested in. If you're the male, you can take the test yourself. Now, so I can work on the Smiths. I can take the Y-DNA test for the Smiths. But what if I'm interested in my mother's surname, Martin? You saw the picture of Granddaddy and Grandmother Martin and all their kids. So what am I going to do if I want to research the Martin line? What's that?
Do you have a sister?
I have no sisters, but again, I'm interested in the Martin line. So I have the male Martin line. I can get one of my cousins, Cousin Sonny, or one of my other cousins whose fathers were those 3 men that were standing in the back that you all thought, my uncles there. They're the sons of those uncles. Their names are Martin. They have the Martin Y-DNA. And I do have some that are volunteering or willing to do that test. So if I want to research, because Martin's a really common surname, I might need to have a Y-DNA test for Martins to figure out which group of Martins I'm related to. And they'll take that test for me. Autosomal testing is the one that tells you about all your lines, because you inherit it you get DNA from all of your grandparents, great-grandparents, and so forth. So it's very useful if you're just doing research on any other line other than your patrilineal and matrilineal. You can do that. Women, of course, can take it. Since they can't take a Y-DNA test, they might take an autosomal, because that could still help them with their surname line. But what generation should it be? Usually you want someone from the oldest generation. In many cases, that's us. But in other cases, you might have a parent or an aunt or an uncle or someone else who can, or grandparent even for some in the room, who can take that test because they're going to have the most chance of matching other cousins. They're farther enough back in time that their DNA is going to keep all those distant relatives that we no longer have access to. It's also helpful, by the way, to test multiple people because if you test, say, yourself, you may also want to test your siblings because you will match people that your sibling won't match. Your sibling will match people that you don't match because you don't have exactly the same DNA. All right, so let me finish out, and then we'll have time for questions, or what do we need to break at that point, is the 5 major companies. So you're going to see that there are a lot of companies in the market now that do this kind of testing. The one that you probably see the most, because they advertise all the time, is Ancestry. They've been very successful with their advertising. And they offer an autosomal test, and in fact, what you do is you spit into a tube, and that is how you provide the DNA because your cheek cells on the inside of your mouth actually have, usually have actually some white blood cells, which does have autosomal DNA, and that is collected that way. So Ancestry does that. 23andMe has done some advertising. They're the ones that really got into the medical aspects of DNA testing, but they also offer at a lower price point, they offer just Ancestry type testing. So they also offer an autosomal test where you spit into a tube. So those are the 2 companies that they offer just autosomal and you spit into a tube. What about Family Tree DNA? That's a company that's based out of Houston, Texas. They have a big testing lab somewhere there. And they've come through it okay. They were not victims of Harvey. Just slowed them down a little bit. They offer all 3 kinds of testing. They offer autosomal testing, they offer Y-DNA testing, they offer mitochondrial testing. So if you test with them, you can send them a sample when they send you the test kit, and then they can actually do multiple tests, which however many you pay for, they can do multiple tests with that same sample. Usually you can just offer 1 sample, and then they'll hold on to it. They have big freezers or whatever, and then they keep it, and then you can later do other tests. Theirs is a little different. They don't do the spit. They do scrape cells from inside the cheek. So do the other companies here. MyHeritage DNA, which is one of the competitors to Ancestry, also does autosomal. They actually use the same part of Family Tree DNA. They actually use them to do their lab work. So it's really kind of the same lab behind both Family Tree DNA and MyHeritage DNA. And it's also a scrape cells from inside the cheek. The newest company that's in the business is Living DNA, and I just got back my first results from them. They're an autosomal test, again, scrape cells from inside the cheek. One of the things that makes them a little different is they are not into matching you with cousins. That's not part of what they do. They're more into telling you where your ancestry is from. So that's real. The other companies all do that too, but that's all Living DNA does. They don't do the matching to, who might be your second cousin or third cousin or something like that. And they are really focused right now in the British Isles to tell you where your ancestors might be from the British Isles, but they're going to be working on Germany too. So it's going to be a little more specific. Most of these other companies, when they tell you where you're from, they cannot be too specific. They don't have that kind of information. They can say Ireland maybe or British Isles, but they can't tell you where. But Living DNA can actually identify parts of Ireland or parts of Britain as to where your ancestors might be from. And I'll take a question in a minute, but the last comment I want to make is that some folks cannot generate enough spit for the spit test. There are some people that have struggled with that. There's all kinds of information online to figure out how to generate more spit, all kinds of things, I don't know, suck on a lemon or something, but there's all kinds of ways to do it. But if it comes down to simply no way to do it, many of these companies will send you a second kit. If you send it in, they go, there's not enough DNA in here to work with. They'll send you, most of them will send you a free kit the second time. Some do more than twice. But that's why we may recommend Family Tree DNA as opposed to, say, Ancestry or 23andMe, is if you're dealing with an elderly relative who simply cannot generate enough spit, they can do this, the cheek scrape instead. Was there a question right there? Yeah.
Do they use the same coding so that if I had Ancestry and my sister did
23andMe or one of the other ones?
Yeah,
Interesting question. Okay. So they are not identical. Each company does do, and the little devices they use to do the actual testing is called a chip. So it's kind of like a computer chip, but it's a chip that actually then is able to figure out when they get the sample of DNA, what are the A's, C's, T's, and G's, and what do you have. They're all looking at about 700,000 locations on your autosomal DNA. But they're not looking at all the same 700,000 locations. There are some differences. There's overlap. So there are companies, Family Tree DNA is one of the companies that you can actually transfer your data from Ancestry or 23andMe to Family Tree DNA. You can actually do it for free and therefore match against other people who tested either with Family Tree DNA or maybe transferred from Ancestry or 23andMe. Ancestry and 23andMe do not take transfers from other companies. There is also some third parties. The biggest one that I've helped out with, and in fact, the one guy who's involved with it behind the scenes is actually in Florida somewhere. It's called GED-Match, G-E-D, Match. It's free. There's a paid version. You can pay more to get some more features. It's free. You can upload from all the companies. You can upload from Ancestry, from 23andMe, from Family Tree DNA, from MyHeritage. I think they're working on the living DNA. But you can upload the data, because all these companies let you download the data, a copy of the data. You wouldn't know what to do with it. I mean, nobody would. It's just it's like a giant spreadsheet with 700,000 numbers in it. But you upload that to GEDmatch, and then that way, again, you can compare your DNA even against other people who may have tested with a different company. So, yeah, if you tested with Ancestry and someone else in your family or whatever did the test with 23andMe, you would both want to find, say, upload to GEDmatch, where then you could compare with each other. What GEDmatch has to do, and what Family Tree DNA has to do when you do this, they have to figure out a way to compare DNA from different testing companies. They have to go through a process to figure out how can we make this work, to say this is the same as this is not. Yeah.